The PETERSEN twins. Gunnison, Kansas, 1966. The landscape was a testament to monotonous flatness, interrupted only by the brutal, unadorned verticality of the industrial grain silos. These concrete cylinders, relics of a post-war agricultural boom, scraped the low Midwestern sky, dominating the horizon in a land defined by its lack of elevation. It was here, on a sweltering July afternoon, that 9-year-old Toby Peterson and his identical twin, Silas, vanished. Their disappearance wasn't marked by a single empty space, but by a chilling excess of presence. The twins, inseparable and eerily synchronized in their movements, were last seen playing hide-and-seek inside the cavernous, dust-choked main grain warehouse connected to silo number 3. The air inside was thick with the scent of stale wheat and industrial decay, visibility low due to the fine, suffocating dust that coated everything. The police search, led by Sheriff Dale Carver, focused initially on tragic industrial accidents, conveyor belts, deep storage bins, or collapse hazards. But the warehouse floor offered the first, maddening anomaly. The thick, fine layer of wheat dust acted as a perfect recording medium. The search team found the deep, clear imprints of the boys' rubber boots walking in toward the back wall. The steps were 9 inches apart, perfectly uniform, the gait of 2 healthy, running boys. Crucially, they found an identical, clear trail of steps leading away from the back wall, moving towards the exit. There were no marks of struggle, no scuffs, no sign of forced removal. But the outbound trail was wrong. The steps were spaced unnaturally close together, a mere 7 inches apart. The total distance covered by the outbound steps, when measured precisely against the surrounding undisturbed floor, was exactly 23% shorter than the distance covered by the inbound steps. It was as if the boys, during their run-out, were traversing the same space but were physically shorter, or that the floor itself had been momentarily compressed beneath their feet. Sheriff Carver dismissed it as an optical illusion caused by the lighting, but the anomaly persisted across multiple measurements. The mathematical distortion was absolute. The twins hadn't just walked out. They had traversed a space that was fundamentally different from the space they had entered. 3 days of exhaustive searching failed to find any sign. The town resigned itself to another cold case, another tragedy swallowed by the silent fields of Kansas. Then, on the dawn of the 4th day, the impossible happened. The twins were found standing perfectly still in a high, dusty corner of the warehouse, directly beneath a massive, defunct overhead crane. They were clutching hands, their eyes wide and dry, staring blankly ahead. They were alive, unharmed, yet their posture was rigid, their bodies unnaturally still. When the rescue team reached them, Silas immediately started sobbing, not tears of relief, but of profound fear. He pointed, trembling, at Toby, whose face, though inches from his own, appeared subtly skewed, as if viewed through a cheap funhouse mirror that only distorted the z-axis. Toby, however, looked calmly past the rescue team, past Silas, and stated in a voice that was eerily distant, completely devoid of the panic Silas displayed, "We are standing on the 11th and 12th planes. We must not be on the first plane together. The stack is unstable." This was the first utterance of the geometric horror that had consumed them. The boys claimed they had been captured by the vertical entity, a localized, plane-eye presence residing in what they called the stacking dimension. This was not a traditional parallel universe, but a non-Euclidean space where the z-axis, height, was artificially compressed and divided into dozens of thin, discrete spatial flaws, like pages in a massive, invisible book. The entity, which they described as a constantly shimmering, elongated silhouette, had not moved them horizontally. It had merely forced them to exist on different vertical planes simultaneously. Toby was on the 11th plane. Silas was on the 12th. The warehouse floor, the ground they stood on, was the first plane, the reference point for normal reality. The entity had forced them into spatial segregation, dictating that they maintain their dimensional separation. Their horrifying lesson was simple. If they were to occupy the exact same horizontal coordinates, the first plane, while their vertical planes were so closely stacked, 11th and 12th, The resulting compression would cause a vertical fold, a catastrophic dimensional collapse that would squash them in the warehouse into a two-dimensional slab of matter, thin as paper. The entity fed on this fear of compression, forcing them to look at each other at precise angles, knowing that the distortion of the perspective was their only warning that they were too close to merging their different planes. Sheriff Carver finally understood the distorted footprints. The short steps they took when leaving the warehouse were proof of their early training in the stacking dimension. They were already learning to exist on closer vertical planes, resulting in the spatial compression of their gait on the first plane. They were not two boys occupying a floor. They were two boys occupying two adjacent layers of space-time, desperately trying to stay apart to avoid the fold. The twins' testimony, riddled with references to planes, vertical velocity, and compression sickness, was initially dismissed by state authorities as shared trauma and hallucination. However, their physical location, Silo Number 3, demanded a closer look. Dr. Eleanor Hayes, a structural physicist from the State University, was called in. She wasn't investigating the missing persons case, but the structural integrity of the aging silos. Her findings were terrifying. She hypothesized that the massive concrete silos were acting as dimensional spines, natural anchors stabilizing the localized stacking dimension. All three silos attached to the warehouse suffered from similar structural decay. Horizontal fractures appeared on the concrete at regular intervals of exactly 12 feet, running from floor to ceiling. But Silo Number 3, the silo closest to where the twins were found, showed an additional, single, deep fracture line at precisely 11 feet 6 inches above the warehouse floor. Dr. Hayes calculated the fracture sequence based on the 12-foot intervals. The regular fractures corresponded to the first, second, third planes, and so on. The anomalous fracture at 11 feet 6 inches corresponded precisely to the theoretical location of the 23rd fracture, a non-standard, stressed boundary point. Toby and Silas's exposure had somehow weakened the system, creating a new, primary fracture point exactly at the boundary of their experience. The 23rd layer was real, and it was stressed. The medical horror was even worse. The twins were hospitalized for observation, but the doctors were meticulous about separating them. When examined by psychologists, Toby and Silas were intentionally positioned on separate beds in the hospital room, separated by a physical distance of 6 feet. But their compulsion to maintain their vertical distance was absolute. When a nurse placed a tray of food on Silas's bedside table, the 12th plane boy, Toby, the 11th plane boy, in the adjacent bed, would instinctively reach out and try to touch the floor beneath his own bed, sometimes scraping his knuckles bloody. They were trying to assert their vertical separation, desperately needing the few inches of empty space between the surfaces beneath them. They believed touching the same horizontal plane, the table, the bed surface, would initiate the long-feared vertical fold. A specialist noticed something impossible during a routine physical exam. When measured precisely, Toby appeared to be 2 inches shorter than Silas, a difference that had not existed before the disappearance. Fraternal twins can have height differences, but these were identical. The difference was small, but statistically significant. More disturbingly, when placed side by side under controlled lighting for shadow analysis, Toby's shadow was subtly elongated, stretching away from the light source, while Silas's shadow was slightly compressed. The angular difference in their projected shadows, when measured against the light source, was exactly 23 degrees of vertical spatial distortion. The stack, the dimension they visited, was not just holding them captive. It was attempting to unstack them permanently by enforcing a minute, but real, vertical difference in their very existence. They were physically altered to occupy different vertical coordinates in linear reality. The entity, known to the twins only as the Layer Keeper, had not held them captive out of malice. It had used them. The twins were the perfect anchors for the 11th and 12th planes because of their identical DNA. By forcing them to exist with a subtle, non-fatal vertical displacement, the Layer Keeper ensured the stack would not collapse entirely, but rather remain stable and compressed. The small difference in their height was the permanent price of stabilization. The final, official directive from the state was to keep the twins physically separated. To protect them from their own internalized terror, the vertical fold, the boys were moved to separate wings of a private medical facility. Toby on the 11th floor and Silas on the 12th floor. The vertical distance was necessary to save them from themselves, permanently. Years later, Toby and Silas still communicate, but only via video phone. They are never allowed to meet in person, and they never will. They are now permanent stabilizers of the stacking dimension, living proof that in Gunnison, Kansas, the horror isn't hidden in the flat horizon, but in the thin, imperceptible layers of space piled vertically above them. The 23rd fracture remains, an unseen crack in reality, and the twins live their lives ensuring that the 11th and 12th planes never, ever meet the first. The Mars family, Lakeside, Illinois, 2008, was a town built on the promise of geometric order. After its old, messy manufacturing industry collapsed, city planners seized the chance to impose a clean, neoclassical structure. Its municipal centerpiece was the Mars Park Rotunda, a vast, perfectly circular grassy area surrounded by a complex, one-way traffic circle known locally as the orbit. The orbit was designed to enforce order, demanding precise curvature and yielding zero tolerance for irregular stopping or turning. It was a local tribute to geometry, and it was here that the Mars family, Father Elias, 42, Mother Clara, 40, and their daughter June, 10, vanished. The family was last seen driving their sedan, a pristine 1998 Volvo, making a single, slow rotation around the orbit just before sunset on a crisp October evening. They were in the innermost lane, the one closest to the park center. The setting sun cast long, clean shadows across the meticulously maintained asphalt. The disappearance was witnessed by a construction worker, Frank Healy, taking a break at a diner across the street. He claimed the car simply faded out of the circle, not by speeding away or stopping, but by dissolving into a shimmering heat haze, like an erased pencil mark on a compass drawing. The light seemed to briefly compress around the car before it was gone. The car was found 3 hours later, still on the innermost lane of the orbit, entirely empty. The doors were locked from the inside, but the windows were slightly ajar. Elias's keys were in the ignition, but the engine was cold. The only immediate physical evidence was the overwhelming scent inside the cabin, a cloying mix of ozone and something metallic, like stale copper. The horror began with a forensic analysis of the asphalt. The tires showed no evidence of skidding, braking, or accelerating. The car had maintained a mathematically perfect velocity of 15.2 miles per hour through the curve. It was an inhuman level of vehicular discipline. Furthermore, the dust patterns on the road, when analyzed by specialized aerial photography, revealed the Volvo's path was not just curved, but was the singular, precise radius within a larger, invisible radial symmetry grid imposed upon the entire roundabout. The key to understanding the geometric mechanics of the vanishing lay inside the glove compartment. Police discovered a series of complex diagrams drawn in ink on parchment paper by the 10-year-old June. They weren't childish doodles. They were meticulously rendered schematics of the Mars Park layout, overlaid with a terrifying mathematical pattern. June had drawn 23 perfect radii emanating from the exact center of the park rotunda, like spokes on a massive wheel. Each line was labeled with a single, cryptic word: entry, wait, shift, hold, return, and the 23rd line was marked simply, focal point. The Mars family had been captured by the radial entity, a localized, planar consciousness anchored to the perfect geometry of a Mars Park traffic circle. This entity demanded absolute adherence to circular motion and radial symmetry, and resided in a space known as the orbital plane. The entity's purpose was to filter out any motion that violated its rules, specifically straight lines, irregular stops, or asymmetrical turns. The Mars family, driving with such perfect curve and speed, had inadvertently qualified themselves for entry into the orbital plane. June's drawing wasn't a warning. It was a blueprint. She had intuitively mapped the 23 spatial spokes that made up the radial symmetry grid. Once the Volvo reached the exact location of the focal point, the 23rd radius, the family's atoms were temporarily reorganized into the pattern required for planar travel. pulling them out of linear reality and into the orbital plane. They ceased to exist as entities in linear motion. They became elements of a constantly curving geometric equation. Their fate was to become perpetual satellites of a localized mathematical horror. 13 months later, the Mars family reappeared, just as suddenly as they vanished. They were standing barefoot at the exact center of the Mars Park Rotunda. They were completely naked, but meticulously clean, standing shoulder to shoulder, facing outward. Their faces were expressionless, their eyes tracking something only visible along the horizon line. When a paramedic cautiously approached, the family began to move, not walking, but gliding in a slow, clockwise circle. They move as a single, synchronized unit, their heads perpetually tilted inward toward the park's center, as if they were satellites tethered by an invisible, unbreakable force to the center point. They could not be forced out of the circular movement. Any attempt to pull them into a straight line was met with a terrifying, instantaneous muscular rigidity and piercing screams of pain. They were physically incapable of straight-line motion. They were perfect elements of the radial symmetry. The Mars family had been captured by the radial entity, a localized, planar consciousness anchored to the perfect geometry of the Mars Park traffic circle. This entity demanded absolute adherence to circular motion and radial symmetry, and resided in a space known as the orbital plane. The entity's purpose was to filter out any motion that violated its rules, specifically straight lines, irregular stops, or asymmetrical turns. The Mars family, driving with such perfect curve and speed, had inadvertently qualified themselves for entry into the orbital plane. June's drawing wasn't a warning, it was a blueprint. She had intuitively mapped the 23 spatial spokes that made up the radial symmetry grid. Once the Volvo reached the exact location of the focal point, the 23rd radius, the family's atoms were temporarily reorganized into the pattern required for planar travel, pulling them out of linear reality and into the orbital plane. They ceased to exist as entities in linear motion. They became elements of a constantly curving geometric equation. Their fate was to become perpetual satellites of a localized mathematical horror. 13 months later, the Mars family reappeared, just as suddenly as they vanished. They were standing barefoot at the exact center of the Mars Park Rotunda. They were completely naked, but meticulously clean, standing shoulder to shoulder, facing outward. Their faces were expressionless, their eyes tracking something only visible along the horizon line. When a paramedic cautiously approached, the family began to move, not walking, but gliding in a slow, clockwise circle. They move as a single, synchronized unit, their heads perpetually tilted inward toward the park's center, as if they were satellites tethered by an invisible, unbreakable force to the center point. They could not be forced out of the circular movement. Any attempt to pull them into a straight line was met with a terrifying, instantaneous muscular rigidity and piercing screams of pain. They were physically incapable of straight-line motion. They were perfect elements of the radial symmetry. The Lynch Girl, New Haven, Connecticut, 1991, was a landscape of uniformity. The Maplewood housing development was a clone-like collection of freshly built, generic suburban homes, all designed to fit perfectly together without wasted space. A human attempt at perfect tessellation. The Lynch family, moving into their house number 14, expected typical middle-class life. 12-year-old Sarah Lynch immediately chose the largest bedroom. The walls were covered in an inexpensive, widely available, yet visually striking tessellated wallpaper, a pattern of repeating hexagons and triangles in muted greens and browns, designed specifically to cover the wall seamlessly, hiding every joint and edge. Sarah vanished from this room in the middle of a Friday night. There were no broken windows, no forced entry, and the doors were locked. The parents woke up to an unnerving silence. When Mr. Lynch walked into the room, he felt a momentary, vertigo-inducing sensation that the walls and floor had momentarily flipped places, a rapid but temporary shift in his spatial understanding. The police investigation found nothing, but the material evidence was uniquely disturbing. A section of the tessellated wallpaper, about the size of a dinner plate, had been neatly excised, cut out, from the wall above Sarah's bed. It wasn't ripped. It was removed with surgical precision, leaving behind a blank, stark square of drywall. Forensic teams analyzed the wallpaper that remained on the walls. Under strong magnification and specialized lighting, they made a profound discovery. The pattern was not mathematically perfect. Every single motif, the hexagon and the triangles, had minute, almost imperceptible deviations. The lines were slightly thicker, the angles subtly rounded, the motifs a fraction of a millimeter off-center. It was as if the pattern was drawn by a human hand, not printed by a precise machine. This lack of perfection created gaps in the continuity of the pattern. 3 weeks later, the missing piece of wallpaper was recovered. It wasn't found nearby. It was taped to the inside of the lynched mail slot, completely flat and dry. However, the pattern on the piece was perfect. The hexagons and triangles had no deviations. The lines were infinitely thin, the angles were absolute, and the colors were uniform. It was a flawless piece of design. When police tried to match this perfect piece back into the hole it presumably came from, it did not fit. It was geometrically incompatible with the flawed pattern remaining on the wall. It was a piece of a different puzzle. Sarah finally reappeared 3 months later. She was found standing in the exact spot where the original wallpaper piece was removed. She was calm, wearing the same pajamas, but her skin had a faint, strange pattern, like marbling, but only visible under specific UV light. When her mother hugged her, Mrs. Lynch was horrified. Half of Sarah's body felt unnaturally cold and stiff, like polished stone, while the other half was soft and warm. Sarah spoke with a flat, monotonous voice, explaining she was taken by the Tyler, an entity that lives in the tessellation plane. This entity had no fixed form but was composed of pure, mathematical repetition. Its goal was to eliminate gaps in reality. The Tyler had told Sarah that her existence, with its unpredictable emotions, movements, and individual choices, created a profound irregularity, a gap, in the spatial order of the house. The Tyler had told Sarah that her existence, with its unpredictable emotions, movements, and individual choices, created a profound irregularity, a gap, in the spatial order of the house. The Tyler held her in a dimension where walls, floors, and ceilings were all infinite, seamless repetitions of the wallpaper pattern. There were no boundaries, no ends, only the pattern repeating forever. This was the core horror, the inability to stand out. Everything was background. The Tyler attempted to correct Sarah by forcing her to become part of the repeating pattern, essentially turning her into a perfect tile to fill the gap. The recovered piece of wallpaper was the perfect blueprint, a flawless template of how Sarah was meant to be tiled into the wall without leaving a geometric defect. Sarah escaped only when she discovered that the original wallpaper in her room was flawed. The tiny imperfections and gaps created just enough instability for her to break the dimensional seal and return. Her body was now the battleground between her innate human imperfection and the forced, crystalline perfection of the Tyler. Sarah Lynch's return brought with it a profound geometric illness, self-tessellation compulsion. She was consumed by the urge for order. She spent every waking hour drawing perfect tiling patterns on huge sheets of paper. If she made a small error in her drawing, a slight overlap, a crooked line, or a visible gap, she would become violently hysterical, screaming that the gap would widen and the Tyler would return to finish the process. Physically, the compulsion was taking its toll. The marble pattern on her skin grew darker. Dermatologists discovered that beneath her epidermis, the cellular layers were forming highly regular, hexagonal structures. Sarah's body was literally tiling itself, organizing along the lines of the Tyler's design. Worse still was the mental breakdown. She lost the ability to recognize herself as an individual entity. If she looked in a mirror, she didn't see Sarah. She saw the repeating patterns in the reflection behind her. Her self-identity was collapsing into the background, becoming just another tile in the infinite set. Detective Rourke, who worked the case, returned to the Maplewood development. He noted that the Lynch house was one of exactly 23 houses in the new neighborhood. He tracked down the original construction blueprints for the development and made a shocking discovery. All 23 houses had the exact same tessellated wallpaper in the master bedrooms. But the Lynch house was the only one where the construction worker who installed the wallpaper made a single, tiny, measurable mistake when matching the first seam. 23 houses, 23 rooms, but only one flaw. Detective Rourke realized that the tiler was not just an interdimensional being. It was a force trying to impose total geometric uniformity on our reality. The tessellation plane was an attempt to create a perfect universe without gaps or individuality. The tiler had specifically tried to use Sarah as a perfect tile to fill the solitary flaw created by the shoddy installation in house number 14. Sarah's imperfection created the gap. Her capture was the attempt at geometric patching. Analysis of the perfect wallpaper piece Sarah returned with revealed the true horror. The piece contained minute traces of Sarah's own skin proteins and tear residue. The piece was not a template. It was a molding sample, taken from Sarah while she was held captive, showing the tiler exactly how to create a geometrically flawless double to permanently replace the flawed original. To save Sarah from the fatal process of self-tessellation, psychologists devised a radical therapy. They forced her to draw and focus on impossible patterns, geometric shapes that can never be tiled, such as the heptagon or non-Euclidean triangles. They used deliberate imperfection as her cure. This worked. After months of drawing irregular, unbalanced shapes that demanded the existence of gaps, the hexagonal pattern on Sarah's skin began to slowly fade. Today, Sarah Lynch is a successful artist. She paints only failed patterns, geometrical shapes that can never be repeated or stacked, that always leave a flaw, a weird angle, or an intentional imbalance. She was not just saved by a defect. She now actively maintains imperfection as the only way to keep herself real and whole. She is the unintentional guardian of reality's imbalance, forever terrified of the smooth, seamless horror that comes with perfection. The tiler is still out there, searching for the best way to close the gap she left behind. Warning: this video contains purely fictional supernatural horror content. The events, characters, and concepts depicted are products of imagination and are not intended to promote, endorse, or normalize any harmful or illegal activities, including child abuse, sexualization, or self-harm.